Good morning. Welcome to First Church Unitarian Littleton's virtual Sunday service. My name is Cindy Malley, and it is my privilege to serve this terrific congregation as one of your deacons. Welcome to my home out in Winchendon, and this is your Community Matters. You should have received this via the listserv. If you know you need to be on that list, please let us know, but here are the highlights. Our beloved DRE Vicky is recovering from surgery. Check the email or your church directory for her address if you'd like to send her some well wishes. Hoke, which is also caring for our aging parents, is meeting via Zoom on Tuesday at 7 p.m. The Energy Self-Care Group will also be meeting via Zoom on Thursday at 7 p.m. And also on Thursday at 7 p.m., there will be a Maundy Thursday service. My fellow deacons and I will virtually serve you communion. So please join us with some bread and some fruit of the vine to continue this annual ritual together. Watch for an email with a Zoom link. Also, we currently have multiple congregants making masks. Thank you. Wendy McDougall and Susan Tordella are making some specifically for our congregation. So please keep an eye for an email from Susan with info on how to get them when they're ready for pickup. And finally, we are in need of hospitality volunteers, particularly for coffee hour. I'm just kidding. It's really weird to do this and not see anybody else's face. But some of you may remember that the last time I led Community Matters, I promised to sign up to make you coffee. And I did. Now, I'm not saying that me signing up to make coffee and the closure of society as we know it are related, but I'm not saying it isn't either. Well, that's it for me. Stay healthy, stay connected. And I do not own a singing bowl to lead us into worship, but I do have a mixing bowl that sounds pleasant when you strike it with a rubber spatula. So I love you.
I'm going to share our call to worship on the screen. Then you shall take some of the blood and put it on the doorposts and the lintels of the houses. And when I see the blood, I shall pass over you, and no plague shall fall upon you to destroy you when I smite the land of Egypt. Exodus chapter 12, 7-13. They thought they were safe that spring night when they daubed the doorways with sacrificial blood. To be sure, the angel of death passed them over, but for what? 40 years in the desert without a home, without a bed, following new laws to an unknown land. Easier to have died in Egypt or stayed there a slave, pretending there was safety in the old familiar. But the promise from those first naked days outside the garden is that there is no safety, only the terrible blessing of the journey. You were born through a doorway marked in blood. We are, all of us, passed over, brushed in the night by terrible wings. Ask that fierce presence whose imagination you hold. God did not promise that we shall live, but that we might, at last, glimpse the stars, brilliant in the desert sky. The words of Lynn Ungar. Let us worship. This is a chance for everyone at home, if you remembered, to light a chalice. I'm going to light one here. I think you can see it. But this is a Unitarian Universalist tradition where we light a chalice. And if you care to, you can say the words of our church's covenant, the covenant of the First Church Unitarian in Littleton, Massachusetts. Love is the spirit of this church, and service our law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. Good morning. It is great to be with you again. This is our 4th week in a row of online live worship. It's an adventure every week, but it's a great way to stay connected even when we're physically distant. So thank you, Malley, for playing Let My People Go, Go Down Moses. Thank you, Cindy, for doing the Community Matters this week. Another thank you, can't thank enough, Wendy McDougall and Susan Tordella Williams for making masks. That's just so wonderful that you're doing that for our community. It's so appreciated. Don't forget, after the service, after the benediction and postlude, check your email. The listserv will have the link for the Zoom Joys and Concerns and for the virtual coffee hour. And a reminder that our lay pastoral minister, once we get over to Zoom and for the rest of the day, is Caroline Marvin. So that's it for our words of welcome this morning. I'm glad you're with us. Thank you for joining us online. And our time for all ages this morning is going to be shared by Susan Palmer, who's filling in for our wonderful Director of Religious Education, Vicki Merriam, who had her procedure and is doing very well and hopefully watching us at home and healing. So Susan, if you want to take us away, I'm unmuting you and asking to start your video. So when you're ready, time for all ages. All right.
Hi, everyone. So I have my chalice here. It has a battery operated light in it, and it was made by Harry some years ago. So today's story is a Passover story. It's not the Passover story, but it is a story that takes place during Passover. And it's at Leah and Sam's house. And it was Passover Seder, and everyone was there, and they just loved Passover. they'd come to the time in the dinner where they were to go look for Elijah. When they came back to the table, Leah was really sad because Elijah hadn't come. And she said, every year we pour wine for Elijah and we look for him, but he's never there. Will we ever see him? And her parents looked at Leah's and Sam's grandmother, and grandmother said, I met Elijah once. I didn't know it at the time, but he came to my house. It was a long time ago when I was a girl, just about your age. It was the day before our dinner, and my mother had been cleaning and cooking all morning, so she was taking a rest, and I was watching my younger brothers and sisters. And there was a lot. You could see that his clothes had holes in them, and he looked tired and hungry. He asked if he could come in and sit by the fire and have some food. Now, we were not a wealthy family. We didn't have a lot to share. And I told him that we had nothing that we could spare for him, and I closed the door. When I looked out the window, I saw that he had gone to our neighbor's house. Now, our neighbor had even less than we did. And what I expected was that she would turn him away. And I was really surprised when she opened the door and invited him in. So then it was the next day, and Mother was cooking Passover meal and setting the table. And she turned her back just for a minute, and she screamed. The dog had jumped up on the table and took our Passover chicken and knocked over the pudding she had made for dessert. We didn't have enough money to buy another chicken or enough time to make another dessert. So we were sitting and crying, and there was a knock at the door. It was our neighbor. She said, I heard the commotion, and I figured that you had some misfortune or some bad luck. I would like you to come to my house and have Passover with us. It seems that I've had more than enough flour to make matzahs, and my soup pot is full. My parents graciously accepted her offer, said they would bring whatever food hadn't been spoiled, and we would be over shortly. After our neighbor left, my mother turned to me and asked, who was it who came to the door while I was resting? And I told her that it was a beggar and that we didn't have enough, and I turned him away. My father asked, where did he go? And I said, to the neighbors. My parents looked at each other and then said to me, do you know who that beggar was? I had no idea. That was the prophet Elijah, my mother said. He comes to see if we are helping to make the world a better place by being welcoming and generous. Well, we had a wonderful Passover with our neighbors. And we found that when we shared from our kitchen, there was plenty for all. And then grandmother said, I never saw Elijah again, but ever since then, I try to treat everyone as if they were Elijah. And when I do, I find that there is always enough. And what it means to treat people like Elijah is that you are kind and welcoming. Thank you. That's our story for today. And Vicki, I hope I did you proud.
Thanks, Susan. So this is the time where we've asked families with kids if they wish to share any joys or concerns. Now's your chance to sign on. And there's going to be a 30-second or so time delay between YouTube, what people are seeing on YouTube and hearing on YouTube, and when you come on Zoom. So be aware of that. When you come on, when you see yourself on, go ahead and mute the sound on your YouTube and just use the sound in the Zoom. And then we won't hear that crazy echo. I know it's a little complicated, but that was the only way we could figure to do it. So thank you so much, Susan. Was that the story by Elisa Davy Pearmain?
Oh, yes, it was. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you so much. Of course, next week is Passover for our Jewish siblings, neighbors, and friends. And so we're thinking this morning of the story in Exodus and of Passover Seders and everything else that happens this time of year for our Jewish friends. It's a great story, the Exodus story of Moses, and I'm going to be summarizing it really quickly in my remarks, or as quickly as I can summarize it. So we'll give just a little more time in case anyone is coming on for the children's joys and concerns. I think it has been probably 30 seconds, so I'll give it just a little more time. I should have something to riff on here for you while we're waiting. You can see behind me, this is the picture of the quilt that we have in our sanctuary. It's a framed picture, sorry about the glare, but it was photographed and framed by Laura Simple. So thank you, Laura, for doing that. Reminds me of our sanctuary while I'm here in my home, sheltering in place. And this chalice, by the way, was a gift from my search team for my installation. It's a beautiful chalice. I know you can't really see it very well. Let me bring it a little closer. It's quite lovely. You can see the detail a little bit. So there you go. All right, I'm going to say that we don't have any children's joys and concerns this week. If you just missed your chance, look for the listserv link in the email and come on to the all ages joys and concerns, and we'll let you go first if you want to, and then you can get off the video. So we'll try it that way. Okay, so now we're going to do the offering. Last week, we shared our offering as well to the church. We've shared the first couple of weeks. We did an offering for charities, local charities helping out in these times. Last week, we asked for funds for our own church. We typically, when we're in person, we do an offering for our church about 3 or 4 Sundays, and then we share the plate with a charity about 1 out of 4 Sundays. So this week, if you wish, we'd love it if you would give a gift to support the good works of the First Church Unitarian in Littleton. If you want, you can put anything in the mail, a check in the mail. That's the address there. You can either send pledge payments or like a loose offering, so to speak. And you can also go to our website now, fculittle.org, and you'll see a donate button on the top right. So this morning's offering will now be given and received in grateful appreciation. Thank you, Malley. That was beautiful. I think we got the sound right on that one, and that, of course, was in honor of Bill Withers, who passed this week. Here. At the end of Genesis, the first book of the Torah, of course, you hear the story of Jacob. That's Jacob of the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, for those of you who know Andrew Lloyd Webber better than you know the Bible, and you know who you are. There is the story of Jacob and the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. So Jacob has gone to Egypt and done really well, and the Israelites are in Egypt and they're doing incredibly well. And so they're sort of fruitful and multiply. Time goes on, and Jacob is gone, and there's a new Pharaoh, and he sees all the Israelites in Egypt as a threat. And so because of that, the Pharaoh enslaves the Israelites, and he wants to make sure that they don't come to power. He also does horrible things, like orders for the Israelites to drown. And so this is the story of Moses. Moses' mother, to save him, famously puts him in a basket. It floats down the Nile. He winds up safely being raised in the Pharaoh's quarters. And so he is spared and he lives. Eventually, Moses grows up and he has a vision. This is the famous burning bush, the bush that is burned but not consumed. So Moses sees the burning bush. It is, of course, Yahweh speaking to him, or God. And Yahweh says to Moses, you have to go and talk to Pharaoh and tell him to free the Israelites. Tell him to let your people go. And I will help you. I'll find a way for you so that you can get out of Egypt, the Israelites, out of Egypt to the land of milk and honey. So Moses indeed speaks to the Pharaoh and tells him, let my people go. But the Pharaoh says no, and he just makes them work harder. Well, this is where the story of the plagues comes in. Moses wants to convince the Pharaoh to let his people go. So he wants to show him how powerful Yahweh can be. So there are the 10 plagues. And each time he tells the Pharaoh a plague is coming and you can avoid, harm to your people if you just let us go. But the Pharaoh always says no. The first plague is that the water turns to blood. The second plague is the plague of the frogs. The third plague is sometimes called the plague of the lice, sometimes the plague of the gnats. The Pharaoh still says no. The fourth plague is the plague of flies. It's usually interpreted as, although it's not entirely clear what it's a plague of. The fifth plague is the pestilence of the livestock. Now, each time, Moses gives the Pharaoh a chance and says, you can let us go and this thing won't happen. And each time the Pharaoh says no. And this is an interesting little detail. The Pharaoh, it'll always say in the scripture that the Pharaoh's heart was hardened, that he had a hard heart. It'll say the Pharaoh hardened his heart, or his heart was hardened, sort of passive voice. But occasionally, and especially after the next plague, around plague 6, which is the plague of boils, the Pharaoh, his heart is hard, but it starts to say in the scripture that God hardens the Pharaoh's heart, which is sort of an interesting change. And everyone's always trying to understand why it changes from the Pharaoh hardening his own heart to God hardening the heart, which is sort of hard to explain away, but it's just an interesting detail. Seventh plague, the plague of hail and fire. Eighth plague, the plague of locusts. Lots of creepy, crawly plagues. That would have worked for me, but for some reason it didn't work on the Pharaoh. The ninth plague was the plague of darkness for 3 days and nights. And finally, the most important plague, which is the death of the firstborn sons. And again, Moses tells the Pharaoh this is going to happen, and the Pharaoh has a hard heart and says, nope, I'm not letting you go. But God wants to spare the Israelites. So he tells them, and this is the famous story of the Passover, God tells Moses to tell the Israelites that if they kill a lamb and put the blood on their doorposts or door frames, the angel of death will pass over their house and they will be spared. And that is, in fact, what happens. And of course, the firstborn of all the Egyptians are killed, and there's weeping and wailing, but the Israelites are okay. Well, this finally impresses the Pharaoh, and he, in fact, lets the people go. So the people are now starting to wander away from Egypt. They've been freed, they're liberated. But guess what? It turns out that the Pharaoh's heart eventually is hardened again, and he decides to send the Egyptian army after them. And this is the famous scene where Moses, of course, parts the Red Sea, and his people pass freely through as the army comes in chase, another picture of it. And then the waters close just in time to get the army, the Egyptian army. And that is, of course, a scene from the 10 Commandments. If you go to YouTube, you can watch a video of the scene, which for the time was pretty decent special effects. In any case, that's the last plague. That does the trick. The army is swallowed up by the water and they stop chasing. But guess what? The Israelites are wandering in the wilderness and they start complaining to Moses. They start complaining and complaining. They say, it would be better to be slaves still than to die in the desert. You know, they're lost, they're hungry, and they're pretty upset. So maybe the Israelites now are the ones with the hard heart. They eventually wind up at the foot of Mount Sinai, and this is where God appears as a storm above the mountain, and he invites Israel into a covenant. The people are afraid, but Moses goes up, and Moses, of course, comes down eventually with the 10 Commandments. And the Israelites agree to it all and say, yep, we'll do that. We'll be in a covenant with Yahweh. And then Moses gets blueprints to build a tabernacle, which is where the Israelites can safely meet with God to worship in that space, these really elaborate blueprints. But guess what? By the time Moses comes down the mountain with the blueprints, the Israelites are already breaking the very first commandment, and they are, in fact, worshiping a golden calf, which they should not be doing. So, of course, Yahweh is very upset. Moses, though, intervenes and convinces Yahweh to leave them alone. Yahweh is merciful and does not kill the people and stays with the covenant. The story ends with, Exodus, in fact, ends with the tabernacle being built, but sadly, tragically, Moses cannot go inside. So that's a pretty sad story in the end. But there's also the wonderful story of the liberation. So what does the story have for us today? Well, of course, we are in a time of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's hard with the plague stories of Passover season not to think of this story. We also think about being in wilderness, sheltering in place feels a little like being in the wilderness, like the Israelites wandering in the wilderness. We are facing a lot of uncertainty, and this feels really uncomfortable and scary. And so we think, gee, should we go back? Can we go back yet to the way it was? But are we being hard-hearted? Or are we being hard-hearted when we don't follow what is being recommended to shelter in place and be very careful? The Israelites found that liberation was costly, and it can feel costly. But the question for us is, do we really want to stay in the system that brought us here, with the extremes of pollution and misuse of the earth and unhealthy practices and extremes of capitalism and so on? And of course, we have now with us modern plagues. This humanist Haggadah for Passover names 10 modern plagues that we deal with. This is some real suffering, not just first world problems, real suffering on earth, modern plagues. We're all living under a lot of stress right now, but there are people for whom the stress is constant and was here before COVID-19, and they need to be liberated too. We can't worship the Wall Street bull as our own golden calf. This is not the way forward. We can liberate ourselves. We can do as the Israelites and find a way to community together, find a way to becoming one people by trusting in each other, by thinking as a team, by finding wise leaders and following them, by adapting a different mindset that nobody wins unless everybody wins. Somebody has said, if we get this right, we'll never go back to normal. And that's the way it was in the story in Exodus as well. You can't go back. You can only go forward. And that can be a great blessing. Maybe even through this plague, we'll find our own land of milk and honey. And I want to end by sharing words of the Rabbi Rachel Barenblatt. She's a blogger known as the Velveteen Rabbi. And this is an excerpt from her poem, Understand. If you want to understand the God of the Torah, of the Exodus, if you want to experience that first redemption along with the children of Israel, you need to learn how to breathe new air, how to receive, how to cup your hands around the name of the person you are still becoming. Our story is old, but today is new. Come, find the miracles. And so that is the lesson for me of the plagues, of the hardened hearts, and of wandering in the wilderness. There is a lesson for us. As Lynn Ungar put it in our call to worship, 40 years in the desert without a home, without a bed, following new laws to an unknown land. Easier to have died in Egypt or stayed there a slave, pretending there was safety in the old familiar. But the promise from those first naked days outside the garden is that there is no safety, only the terrible blessing of the journey. May we be there for each other on our journey to wholeness. May it be so. Blessed be, and amen. This is the time for our benediction. After the benediction, Malley will play a postlude, and during the postlude, I will be sending out an email that will tell you the link for the Zoom meeting after this to share joys and concerns and a virtual coffee hour. So we can't hold hands for a benediction, but if there is somebody with you there and you can hold hands safely, I invite you to do that. Otherwise, I invite you to hold your hands together and feel that warmth, and remember the warmth of holding hands, and you will have that feeling again soon. So the words of our benediction. Friends, in this unprecedented time, we can find our way through. We've never been promised safety, only given the gift of life. Life isn't now as we have known it, but things will get better again. May this journey teach us a new way to a new land of milk and honey, a new land where all are free. May it be so. Blessed be, and amen. Go in peace.